Hey guys, welcome back to our discussion of At a Graveside, the third essay in Soren Kierkegaard's three discourses on imagined occasions. As we closed out the last installment, we were talking about how that there was nothing that Soren was going to be talking about in this particular discourse that would be at odds with anything considered to be godly or unholy. So whatever we're going to be talking about here is largely going to harmonize with established conceptions of religion and God and whatnot. He's not going to be too blasphemous or anything like that. But it doesn't mean that what he's going to say here isn't going to be offensive on some level to a lot of ears. And what he's primarily concerned with, as we discussed this section called Death's Decision and enumerating the different qualities that death has, is trying to understand, he's trying to articulate that, look, every single individual is racked with fear that their life will account or amount to nothing. He says on page 77, but to fear for himself and fear having his life in vanity in the moment in imagination, page 77. And you see this a lot. A lot of people, we're in a political season right now. And regardless of how you feel about the current political situation, there are a lot of people who look for sort of personalities, ideologies, things like that to maybe ward off the fear of their life not having some sort of significance. If they can group together in some way, maybe their lives have more meaning. If they can get out in the streets, or they can have, kind of be conversant in the same sort of political talk or whatever, that somehow they matter. Maybe they matter in accordance to like world historical movements. And it's not just political systems where this happens. This happens in regards to, I don't know, lifestyle choices. I see maybe you'll see this on Facebook or something like that a lot, where individuals are at the beach or out on a lake or doing whatever they think is like fun or whatever. But how many people are really actually enjoying themselves when they're doing that? I know there's the old thing is like, hey, can money buy happiness? Have you ever seen someone miserable on a jet ski? But I mean, there is this sense that there are people who try to aggregate around certain ideas, personalities, lifestyles in order to make sure that their life has some sort of meaning. Meanwhile, Kierkegaard's saying, well, that's nonsense. What do you think? What did you guys think about all of that? I particularly like the quote that follows this up. I felt like it articulates pretty much my worldview, and I'll read that, and I want to give the floor to you. It says, the person who is without God in the world soon becomes bored with himself, and expresses this haughtily by being bored with all life. But the person who is in fellowship with God indeed lives with the one whose presence gives significance to even the most insignificant. So what I'm trying to say here is, I've done the political thing, I've done the hedonistic thing, and I was still bored. And it really, and what we'll talk about more, it really was the confrontation of death, the confrontation of God, that even when we do something very hard like this, like try to break down difficult existential philosophy, put together a product that helps people understand it better, actually this moment is the only moment that matters to me. All right? And it's the only moment that has any sort of significance to me. I'll shut up.
Well, it's funny that you were talking about living on the side of a lake, because all I could think of was Thoreau and how lived beside a lake in Walden Pond, and that was his thing. He was like, I have to live life deliberately and suck the marrow out of life. Now I'm wondering if that's maybe a more poetic, and he's not like, I have to live with earnestness because my death is imminent, and I don't accept it as a human condition but my own condition. But yeah, it's interesting when you hear things like, even like, YOLO or Carpe Diem and all of that, and you wonder if any of that is actually, or suck the marrow out of life or anything like that, and you wonder if it's actually just a lifestyle thing, or if it's more of a, I don't know, way of escaping the earnestness of like, you're gonna die soon. But then again, YOLO is like, you only live once, so I don't know if that is accepting one's own mortality. I have no idea, but it was interesting you brought up.
It'd be interesting to contrast the two views. There is a sort of religious YOLO that Kierkegaard is.
I'm so sorry to bring this up.
No. But there is sort of a religious YOLO that he is trying to emphasize here. I think he would think there is something frivolous about a YOLO that is irreligious or non-religious, and we can talk about why he would think that. I think it will become more obvious to us. Because I think what he'll say here is that the irreligious or unreligious YOLO is hollow, whereas the religious YOLO is there's actually some substance that's being cultivated and developed.
So there's some marrow in the religious. Yeah, because maybe when because I'm wondering if Thoreau. I'm trying to even know if Thoreau was religious. I mean, I know obviously the Transcendentalists had some kind of spiritual. At least Emerson had some kind of spiritual, or at least I don't know, had a spiritual existence or like belief in a god or like nature or something. But I wonder, at least in that sense, whether like that idea of just like let's just live life like in the present moment and all of that, which Kierkegaard is endorsing, but that irreligious kind of living in the present, like you said, if that does have any kind of substance or whether it doesn't have the human condition.
I think he would think that it's a form of escapism. I think he would think that that sort of that YOLO, that carpe diem sort of mentality is like, oh God, like there is this sort of imminent thing that I will die that I have not reconciled myself with. So like, let's distract myself with as many jet ski rides and parasailing and cliff diving and cruises and intoxicants and whatever and fervor at political conventions and stuff like that. Anything to get my mind off of what I know to be inevitable.
Death is a threat then, not a teacher and not a friend. Yeah. And that's the difference.
Yeah, I like that.
And so like, what's I'll say this: staring down death is remarkably economical because like in the sense that like if you do stare down death and you make your peace with it, like you don't need to like parasailing is really expensive. Like going to like Cleveland for a political convention is really expensive. But meanwhile, I can just be right here with you guys and have as rich an experience as going someplace exotical, you know?
You know,
It's actually very cheap to be an existentialist, is what I'm trying to say. So if you didn't have enough reasons for being an existentialist, it's good for the pocketbook.
Yeah.
Yeah. You don't need the jet ski.
Everything has... Well, actually, there's a word you left out of the quote here when you put it here.
I must have
typed
it hastily.
The God whose presence gives infinite significance to the most insignificant.
Yeah, so even those jet skis maybe can have kind of, the gravitas to them. We're just walking, going to the lake, can have a certain gravitas.
Yeah, I'm not saying I can't ever enjoy time on a jet ski, but...
I love, again, though, the aesthetic and the ethical here. You know, the bored, like the person who is without God in the world soon becomes bored with himself, and you know, either or one is all about this boredom and despair.
When was the last time you were bored? I don't understand. Like people say all the time, like, "There's nothing to do. I'm so bored." I haven't been bored in a decade. Like when was the last time you were bored? I mean,
well, that's interesting too because we have social media and everything where you don't have to be bored. You can be constantly stimulated in some way, and whether that stimulation is actually productive is another story. That could just be another escapism in and of itself. So you could be saying like, you're just doing grooming, social media grooming, or in some way, but you're not actually doing something productive.
I don't know. The idea of going to a beach or like a rock, some rock concerts and things like that are very boring to me. Those things are boring. I'd rather be doing that.
Rock concerts, maybe. The beach, though. That is.
I'm missing out.
That's my jam.
Just like
what's so interesting. What's so interesting is that we did Kierkegaard's on the lilies in the field. That's all I was thinking of was how he talks about a stillness and a certain stillness that the birds and the lilies have, and that we should cultivate that in our own lives, or a silence before God. And I'm wondering if we can have a silence if we're always being busy and worrying about whether we're making a quote-unquote dent in the world.
Yeah. I need a vacation. I need
this is basically an intervention, a work intervention.
Yeah. Actually, CJ got up and stopped recording a second ago. This is really just a conversation with us telling you to take a vacation.
Holy shit.
Can that go on the website?
That's pretty funny. That's a good joke. That's a good bit. You guys got some funnies today. I like it.
So death is decisive, though.
Mm-hmm. So that's the first characteristic.
The first thing to be said is it is decisive. What did you think of that idea of it being decisive? I'm going to do what Luke did to me like last time. Like, okay, I'm going to say this. What do you think?
I mean, it's interesting because Kierkegaard said there's not much to say. At least from what I got, there's not much to say. Is that it happens and it's done. You can't really do anything else. Like once you try to describe death, it's it's done. It almost strikes me more as a verb than as a noun or anything. It's an act. It's just, it happens, and then once it happens, it's gone like that.
It's funny how you were talking about how death is silent in all the movies, like in the Christmas Carol and Seventh Seal.
Yeah.
And he has these words here. He makes a comment about how we're reminded how sparing the words of death are.
I think as he says that death is the most decisive of any decision we make in life. Death is probably the most decisive that we can make. Because
there is another that we'll get to. He thinks there's another decision that we can make that might be equally as decisive. But death has its own qualitative decisiveness, and I think I would just add to that there is like a remarkable finality to it, and that may seem obvious to everyone, but I don't think we really understand that. And then goes back to this carnival-like existence that we live in modernity. There was a point in human existence where death was like, the angel of death was like around the corner for every human being. Even like in Kierkegaard's time, like people were still dying of diseases that like we don't have to think about at all anymore. So we have this interesting position in modernity where like our average lifespan in America, I don't know what it is, like let's say it's 76.2 years or something like that. We live relatively long, and there seems to be like this postponement of death, like it'll never really happen to us, and then all of a sudden we hear a terrible story about a car wreck or something to that effect, and it's like, oh, it's made suddenly real to us. But as someone like Kierkegaard and people in that day even, they had a better understanding of death than we do. And what I think what ends up happening is like, it seems like we fail to existentially develop on the proper timetable in modernity because we don't think death is a real possibility for us.
Well, it's interesting too. There's an interesting thing. So I saw in here a critique of Hegel that I thought was really interesting.
How so?
So there's this line, one who is living does not have it in his power to stop time, to find rest outside time in the perfect conclusion, and a conclusion of joy as if there were no tomorrow, and a conclusion of sorrow as if it could not be it could not be a drop more bitter, and a conclusion of the contemplation as if meaning were entirely finished, and the contemplation were not in turn a part of the meaning, and the conclusion of an accounting as if the moment of settling an account did not also take on its own responsibility. So these ideas of the perfect conclusion outside of time, this contemplation of meaning as if it were entirely finished. You know, if you read the beginning of the Phenomenology of Spirit for Hegel, like paragraphs like 17 through 21, there's this idea of the circle where like we're all in this like circle. It's like we all start where we are. We exhaust the possibilities of thought through skepticism. Then we with the common like thesis, antithesis, then synthesis. Like then we start at a new place. Then we exhaust that. Then we move around this circle until we reach absolute knowledge, and then God can think God's thoughts about God's self. And it's this perfect conclusion. And in concluding unscientific postscript, Kierkegaard like knocks this like between like pages like 73 and 120 in the Hong translations. You have this thing where Kierkegaard's like, yeah, don't worry, the perfect system will be done next Sunday or something like that.
It's coming right along.
Yeah. And that's why Kierkegaard says there's no system of existence except for God. Like, so for us, we can't reach this point outside of time where we can just contemplate meaning and absolute knowledge and think God's like we exist, and each generation has to start over and learn to exist. We can't exhaust those possibilities as existing human beings and reach that outside of time. Like we're finite, we exist. There's no conclusion or finishing absolute knowledge point we can reach, and death reminds us of that and calls us to live and actually exist.
Yeah, it rips us right out of that system back into our particularity. And I think I believe these are his words. I think he thought such philosophical systematizing would be an indulgent lethargy. Something that I think he would think would be you want to talk about privilege. I think he would think that a privilege for you would be able to do that, to have that's not very consoling because it doesn't really offer much to people who have to live real lives, who may not have the elevated IQ and all of that.
And I think it's paragraph 17 through 21 in Hegel. I'd have to double check that, but I know it's in the intro.
So yeah, I mean, do you think, because he talks to us a little bit about this, like I read it. We're doing Marcus Aurelius. CJ just led a discussion on Marcus Aurelius, and Jordan will be doing one after him. And there was in Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, there's a lot of conversation about being at peace with death, because it's either like it's like this slumber, this dissolution of elements, or you used to see this in Socrates or something like that as well, like why we ought not to fear death. And Kierkegaard talks about how that is sort of like people either have not really appropriated what death is, or sort of have this sort of, are childishly sort of antagonizing death, like taunting it in some way. And I wonder if you are reading Hegel into this, if like he's trying to say that this sort of lust for this position of like godlike knowledge within this Hegelian circle that you're talking about, where like God comprehends himself through the individual or whatever, if that's some sort of fantastical romanticization of death. Is that how you read him? Is that what I'm getting from you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like that essentially doing Hegelian dialectics is an illusory way of dying to oneself. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah. And again, it's this idea of the problem of trying to locate yourself as a system, like, because it becomes a human condition at that point. It doesn't become your own death in finiteness. Yeah. Like you as a human can't become absolute knowledge.
Right.
Like you can't like.
Well, why can't you? Because I think that's important. Because I agree with you, and it's something that Kierkegaard probably draws out in not this text but in others. But I think someone may be saying, "Oh, I agree," but the argument for this, I think, runs along the lines of the reason why an individual can't have that absolute knowledge or whatever is that fundamentally spirit is something that can't be scientifically systematized. That like what we are as immaterial beings is not going to be something subject to the laws of logic and science and things like that. I think it reflects how Kierkegaard has problems with psychology as well. He is a psychologist, but he'd be very anti like the scientific streak that is in our modern day psychology programs or whatever, where people think that you can sort of just address depression with throwing a bunch of pills at it or something like that. Similarly, he would say you can't address the despair of death by trying to get some sort of objective vantage point. You're trapped by your particularity, and you might as well endure it and embrace it. Right? I mean, does that make sense? If the spirit is something that's immaterial, it's not going to be subject to law. If it's free,
You might know more of Hegel than I do.
I know it's not a Hegel thing that I know, but I know Kierkegaard's response to Hegel, and that's why I really want to cover more Hegel for the Noetic app, because this is the problem: is that I know that Kierkegaard knows his Hegel, but how fair is he to Hegel?
Yeah,
and I think the Hegel that I do know comes from a third party. So am I experiencing some sort of philosophical telephone? Is it?
Yeah.
Am I? And I think really to do Kierkegaard right, I've got to go back to that stuff and put together seminars on Hegel.
Well, I think the issue with Hegel is one. There was one book on the concluding unscientific postscript. I forget who the author is, but he compares Hegelian knowledge and individual existence with the knowledge of the scientific community and the individual. Like, as an individual, you can't live as scientific knowledge. Like, in the end, you make decisions all the time that lack full, complete knowledge. And that's the difference between absolute knowledge and individual existence. Is like, systematic knowledge is eternal. It keeps getting added to and added to and added to, generation after generation. But you as an individual can't live there.
Yeah.
Well, like, think about it like in regards to what we're doing, right? Like, and maybe this would be an unfair comparison, but I think this is kind of what he's going at. So, like, in Noetic, we're building this repository of knowledge on the Noetic app, which you should download, right? Like, and our voices are, like, distilled, who knows, like, in this body of knowledge forever, for however long or whatever. But, like, our existence isn't bound up in that repository. Like, we may be sort of contributing to it right now. Like, we may be doing some sort of ghost busting where it's siphoning off all our language and speech and, like, being added to that vault of knowledge for people to enjoy forever and ever. But, like, then we have to stop this and go back. Like, life is going to, like, set conditions on us. And one of the things that life sets a condition on is death. Like, death is like, nope, you are not this eternal, like, thinking being that's just, like, channeling the absolute. Like, you have real things that are going. You have biological processes, i.e., death, that are going to bring this to a screeching halt.
Yeah.
You know, and yeah, you're not going to become immortal by trying to merge yourself into this repository of knowledge.
Yeah.
I think Kierkegaard wants to get us away from any of those conceptions. I think he thinks Hegel encourages such a perspective.
What would you think of scientists that almost seem to accept that and say, yes, I know I'm not going to live further, but I want to still live in this sort of thing where I can still try to understand the world and do all that stuff?
Oh, Kierkegaard's not going to be anti-science or anti-philosophy.
No, yeah.
I think what he's going to say here is the fact that death will exact its constraints, or he'll say that he'll say existence exercises its constraints.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that you can't do science or you can't do philosophy. It just means you've got to do it with the approach to it has to be different. It's like everything else that we've talked about with Kierkegaard. You don't have to stop being an artist once you become an existential Christian for Soren Kierkegaard. You don't have to stop being an ethical person. Like, these things get subsumed into the new life perspective. Similarly, so everybody knows here that I'm a Christian, but yet I'm going to do Kant and Hegel. I would say I'm going to do Kant and Hegel and everybody else with even greater vitality and vigorousness than I did when I hadn't made that sort of conversion with the help of Soren Kierkegaard. And the reason why is because it becomes like a divine sort of calling for me to manifest what's gone on, the internal change within me in these forums. And now not everybody has to do that, but Kierkegaard's saying, if you do have this sort of confrontation with God, you realize that death is this ultimate night and life is this light, and you've got to get to work. There's a sense of urgency with what you're doing. He says on page 83, one who works with all one's might gains only the proper opportunity to wonder at God. So when we're doing, when we're doing philosophy, there is, and when you're doing anything, the knight of faith could be a tax collector. The knight of faith can be a musician. The knight of faith can be a philosopher. But within that vocation, that role that you have, you're to enact the love and the gratitude that's given to you, and sort of understand your limited time upon the planet. That's what I took away from it. And what I think is really awesome about confronting death and its particularity from an entrepreneurial perspective is that he's like, once you recognize death and how it fundamentally limits time becomes infinitely more valuable. You've got to get to it. Music right now or something like that. Is not a very valuable product because there's so much of it. It's totally ubiquitous. The market's flooded. People won't pay anything for it. But if musicians started hoarding it and taking it out of that sort of common area or whatever, the value of it would go up again, and they could start having people pay for it. That's why services like Tidal and things like that have come along. Now, whether or not that's a good thing or not, I'm just talking about economic dynamics. Similarly, if we don't think of time as infinite and we recognize the finality of death, every moment becomes much, much, much more valuable than when we thought we had this hourglass and just every day was this speck of sand that went through and it would never really run out.
Yeah, it's not good. The Hegelian issue Kierkegaard is addressing is don't confuse your finite existence with this infinite, infinite, eternal thing that isn't your actual existence.
Okay, or objectivity or some kind of that makes sense.
Yeah. So the next characteristic of death is that it's indefinable. So we just talked about its decisive character. Now we think that, okay, all right, fine, we get it. Then the next thing we may think, okay, we get this too. Death is indefinable, and I'm trying to get my head around this here a little bit. Yeah. We think we know what death is. Okay, fine, it's death. It's final, and we're all made equal in it. But this shouldn't lull us into some sort of understanding, because ultimately we don't know anything about the nature of that equality. It could be a big dirt nap. It could be perdition. It could be hell. It could be heaven. There's an equality in the sense that it happens to everyone, but there is incredible uncertainty in regards to what occurs once it happens. So there's a certainty, but there's also uncertainty mixed in with death.
Which I've thought about this in terms of like Christian doctrines and beliefs on the afterlife. So like I can hear a fundamentalist now watching this podcast and going, well, no, we know what death is like, and then like giving like quoting a bunch of Bible verses as though that settles it. Mm-hmm. But I feel like that kind of that problematically mixes the idea of faith and knowledge, which Kierkegaard in a lot of ways is abiding by. That split between what we can actually know through empirical experience and, if we're going with Kant's view, translated, there's the whole issue of like empirical experience versus our, working with intuitions and all these other things happening that like cause us to like, I don't have like on my Kant, you know what I'm talking about, like when the...
I'm sorry, I was looking at my notes. Say it again.
So Kant, the difference between faith and knowledge. So for Kant, it's this mixture of empirical experiences mixed with intuitions that help us to order all the a prioris and everything that help us to order those actual experience. And there's that rub between the empirical things in themselves, between the phenomena and the noumena. How we're like the intuitions in our own heads, in our own minds versus like the phenomena on the outside.
Yeah.
Like that's where knowledge comes from. And for Kierkegaard, he'd be saying that, faith isn't knowledge because it's this, there's no rub against empirical experience. Yeah. There's no friction there. And so I think, for the fundamentalist or the intense Christian who would hear us say that death is indefinable, they might say, well, no, we know what death is. Resurrection, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. That really doesn't deal with the fact that, like, in the end, you've never died.
Yeah.
You don't
we
know,
only do it once. Yeah.
You don't know what that experience is actually like. The feeling of dying, the experienced phenomena of dying.
Yeah.
Like... And so I feel like there's this element where Kierkegaard is addressed, and I feel like that's important to say, especially if a intensely religious person hears us talking about Kierkegaard in this way, reads this discourse. Mm-hmm. This indefinability and this issue of faith and knowledge need to be addressed because Kierkegaard is addressing the fact that like faith isn't like it's a hope against hope. It isn't knowledge. It isn't like, oh yeah, we know.
Yeah, it always reminds me of military intelligence has this like idea of like the unknown known, where it's just like, oh, it's like death is like you said, oh, it's like resurrection. Like I haven't done it yet, but like I know what's going to happen. It could like you expect like expect the unexpected sort of thing. Yeah. But then there's like a unknown, which is like
you're doing Rumsfeld right now.
Yeah,
the Pentagon philosophy.
Yeah, well, the idea of like the unknown, where it's like I can't really predict what I'm going to experience because I don't know what I'm going to experience. Yeah. So I think that's the same thing you're talking about, where it's just like death, like we only do it once, and like nobody's come back. Well, but then again, you would have those
one exception.
Yeah, yes, and it's
one possible exception.
Right? Oh no, and the most important exception, which I think goes to Kierkegaard all the way. But yeah, at least for us humans, like, we don't know what death is like. So yeah, it's just this unknown, I guess, for us. I guess that's what he's saying. It's indefinable.
Well, yeah, even if the conservative evangelicals listening to this and be like, them boys, they don't know what death like it says there in the scripture, even if it involves everything that is potentially spelled out in scripture, and I don't even know what that would be, you don't know if that's your lot. Like it is. We don't really, and this is going to be something like, it's not up to us to determine whether or not that lot is something that we're going to experience. I've referenced this in other seminars, how Kierkegaard says that if he were to die and everybody else were to be spirited away to heaven and he found himself in the belly of hell, he would still bless God because he could see God's justice at work. It wouldn't matter where he ended up in the divine schema of things. So even if you think that that it's perfectly spelled out into the Bible and it goes according to these aesthetical categories or whatever, that doesn't mean that that's your destination. Mm-hmm. Like, you can think that, but you may be wrong. And really, the only person that knows if you, for certain, is God. God is going to determine whether or not you get a particular version of the afterlife. You can pray all you want and try to appropriate and stuff like that, and like, there's reason for hope and there's reason to think that you experience God's salvation, but you really won't know until it's all over. And what's really interesting about this known unknown or the unknown knowns or wherever the uncertainty is in the indefinable character, of death, Kierkegaard says that it's going to be the fact that there is so much uncertainty in this thing that makes everybody equal, that we don't really know what's going to happen, is that it's going to make people like be like, hey, maybe I shouldn't be hang gliding as much as I should be, like sort of like working on my existential house. But also it's going to impel people to seek a different type of equality. Specifically, it's going to like force people who are scared to death of death and its indefinable nature and its finality to actually do what happened in the first discourse, which was to make a confession before God and seek a different kind of equality, the equality of sin that every human being has. The first, CJ, you did the discourse on occasion of a confession with me, and we talked, and that's what it was all about, how there is ubiquity of sin, and that like this is possibly the only other thing as decisive as death is when we, so death may sort of like impose itself on us, but we have this choice to choose the thing that may potentially conquer death, which is God. And this is in the earlier installment, the one we did right before this, we talked about, well, where's the religious in any of this? I think it comes up here in the second trait of the indefinable nature of God.
And it's kind of frustrating. I mean, at least like saying like that's really frustrating for people that want to think that death is this great equalizer that, well, I wasn't, I guess, like death equals everyone, even like from the pauper to the king. So I guess there's this consolation maybe from somebody that's not like, I'm not a king, but I'm be like, oh, well, the king's just going to get wiped out anyway. Like he doesn't get a free pass either. But we don't even know that for sure either. And that's what's, I suppose, frustrating. And I think that's what Kierkegaard kind of mentions.
Yeah, but I see. Like a lot of people think Kierkegaard's really dark, but he says that like no one can guide us on these issues of death or whatever. But I love this stuff, man. Maybe I'm just like totally in love with sadness. But he says on page 95, he says, uncertainty lends a hand, and like the teacher points steadily to the object of learning and says to the learner, pay close attention to the certainty, then earnestness comes into existence. And then I guess, like it's going to drive us, the fact that there is this indefinable character, to cultivate that earnestness in seeking sort of resolution before God, making a commitment to God. So we see how these qualities of death, of finality and indefinableness, are leading to the shedding of aesthetical and even ethical categories, and to the fomenting of this earnestness that Kierkegaard keeps referencing, which I don't know. I mean, you and I, we haven't experienced it as much in the books that we've covered on Noetic so far. It's largely something that's talked about in Philosophical Fragments and Concluding on Scientific Postscript. But I'm taking this term earnestness to be interchangeable with subjective truth. Is that how you read that? So like this is just giving us a richer understanding of what Kierkegaard's program of subjective truth development is.
Earnestness, inwardness, I mean all that.
So
I kind of see it as concernedness, like passionate interestedness, like all that. I see all these terms.
These words are all interchangeable for you too. I just want to make sure, because I think you might have a little. You're more widely read than I am, I believe, at least on the secondary literature. No, whatever. Yeah, and then there's one more. But do you guys have anything else you want to say before we move on to?
There's an interesting little passage from page 94 that I think wraps up the idea of like the certain, like we said, like death is certain, and then there's this part that's uncertain. And Kierkegaard says, the certainty of death is the earnestness. Its uncertainty is the instruction, the practice of earnestness. The earnest person is the one who, through uncertainty, is brought up to earnestness by virtue of certainty.
I love that quote. I had that one written down as well.
Like, through the so I guess it just makes sense. Like through the uncertainty, we're brought up through the certainty that we're going to go through this uncertainty of death or something like that. It's just like
Well, the certainty of death married with the fact that it's inconsolable, that it explains nothing, which we'll get to in a second, that it's undefinable, indefinable, and that it's
the experience itself is uncertain. Like,
what
is it like?
Yeah, that's going to actually make you grow up in an existential way.
Yeah. it's hard to wrap my mind around. It's the closest I think I've gotten to like a certain like looking down in the abyss as like in Kierkegaard as I've gotten. It's just like looking, it's just like I don't know what's down there, but I know it's there, and like what do I do? You know, I don't know.
And this leads, this segues to the last characteristic. We've already sort of mentioned it here, that death explains nothing, and it really does. It needs an explanation. But the fact that it needs an explanation, that we scream out like, "Please, death! Like, why do we have to go through this? Why is there suffering?" And like we get silence in return. But the earnestness lies in just that the explanation does not explain death, but discloses the state of the explainer's own innermost being. The more that we're like sort of demanding death to like give an account of itself, shows that we haven't really properly constituted ourselves in equality before God. Is what I hear him saying here. So like a lot of people think that this is like one of the problems of Christianity, in the sense that it like a lot of people are like, well, it's part of God's plan, and like Jesus called my aunt home, and this and that it doesn't really, that it sort of like just kind of makes things easy for people to understand. But I think what Kierkegaard's really trying to say here is that if we're just like clawing and screaming and being like, oh God, why, da 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 da, like we haven't properly appropriated the eternal, and we need to work more on that. But what's interesting about this, and I'll just interject this here. He says that if you are demanding these explanations and trying to like wring out something from death, that this is almost a childish perspective. Like, and that really the only way to make death powerless is to seek that which is eternal. What's kind of interesting about all of this, and this raises, I'll leave this as sort of like a discussion question, is what notable figure calls into question death? I mean, Christ himself, Christ, yeah. Right? Christ.
That's what you were into earlier, like, right? Yeah. Jesus. No, you were relating to that earlier where I was like, nobody knows death. You're like, oh, except one guy. One figure, Jesus Christ.
Well, Christ on the cross goes, right. He says, what does he say? He says, my God, or why hast thou forsaken me?
Yeah.
Right? Like, he knows he's going to... he experiences uncertainty.
Or even the agony of the garden.
He's petitioning something, God himself, who I don't know. This is super fascinating, right? Because like
Trinity is hard,
right?
Wait, my God, so he's talking to himself,
right? Exactly. Like Christ is enduring all of these things that the human endures, but at the same time, he's the divine incarnate. It's like Christ himself, the person that is supposed to help us conquer death, as a human incarnate, had to endure the threefold nature of death itself. He had to experience the uncertainty of it, the inexplicable nature of it, and the finality of it in his embodied being. And maybe you could make the case that he had to experience that for there to be true salvation on the Trinitarian model. But what's interesting, like I said, Christ is our intercessor, but he endured it as well. And that is like...
No, yeah. I mean, that's the whole... I mean, I know it's a cheesy statement where it's like, like God, Christ, like, knows you. Like, he knows your pain because he went through the most excruciating pain. And yeah, so it's like, I mean, in that cheesy sense, or that cliche, there's that truth like that you just mentioned. He went through...
If God was invincible, if God was Superman or whatever, he really couldn't know the human condition. So, like, God almost has to, like... In order for God so we may not have this objective knowledge that we talked about, but there is subjective knowledge between subject and savior, right? You would agree with that? Subjective understanding, whatever you want to talk about subjective truth as. But it's like we have concrete examples here of things that Christ had to endure so that we could properly know him. Otherwise, he would just be like some alien.
Well, that's why, Kierkegaard, I think that's part of why that plays into Kierkegaard's understanding of Christ as the pattern or the prototype, depending on which translation you use. Pattern's probably cooler. Christ is the pattern that we then follow, we then imitate. In philosophical fragments, the king has to become like the maiden in order for the maiden to really relate to the king.
Yeah. If the king had approached the maiden in his kingly robes or whatever. She wouldn't have really loved him. She would have just been a fangirl, right? Yeah. And the fact that he has to become so humiliated allows for there to actually be a transaction between human and divine.
That's interesting. That's almost like, yeah.
That's a big theme in Philosophical Fragments. And, you know, we're going to start working with Craig Campbell, and he's like, yeah, are you guys going to do Philosophical Fragments? And it's so dense, I've been hesitant to take it up, but maybe we should.
Well, and even theologically with Christ too, in terms of like what the kingdom of God is like. You know, I almost think of it in like the second, maybe it's the third Pirates of the Caribbean. You know, it's almost like we live on this world of violence and death, and it's almost like Christ has to, like, you remember when they turn the ship over and they come back to the land of the living? It's almost like the kingdom of God is like that, where, you know, we're living up here and we need to invert to really enter what the kingdom of God is like. So Christ has to go through death to come out life on the other side. Kind of like when you see the quasar where the light goes through and comes out on the other side.
Isn't that Dante too, where they have to go through hell to get to at least, I don't even know if it was purgatory or at least like paradise. They had to like just like go through under and then get to heaven.
It like inverts.
Yeah, it's just
Well, cool. Look, I think it was a pretty productive conversation, guys. I'm pretty proud of us for working through all three of these discourses. I believe we did it in 5 or 6 installments. So, thanks, guys, for doing all this.
Sure.
If there's anything else you want to close with, please do.
Extra thoughts.
For the record, because Luke weirdly plugged Noetic here on Noetic multiple times during this one. You know, there's a comment he makes in the notes, and I think it's directly says that death is a teacher. There's an interesting article on Kierkegaard's use of the concept teacher in the series Kierkegaard Research, Sources, Reception, Resources from Ashgate Publishing. And I think it's volume 15, tome 6, where someone here on this panel wrote a thing on Kierkegaard's use of teacher and mentions death as teacher. It's, maybe you should check it out on Google Books, maybe buy it for $150. Whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
Put in the links.
Yeah, man. I'm sure it's really great. Matt is a fantastic writer and has a great command of this stuff. So it's well worth your time. And I've contributed to that resource as well. It's a really great resource in secondary literature. Mm. Yeah. Awesome. So, CJ, any closing thoughts from you? You good, man?
I think I'm good.
All right. I guess we'll powwow and we'll figure out what we do next. Okay. All right. See you guys.